Well, I guess we'll get rolling with at least the introductory part of our session today. Good morning. It's great to see you all here. I am Dave Renz, Director of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. And it's a pleasure to step in and pick up in this next phase of our nonprofit navigation series. So thanks for taking the time to join us today. If you have questions or comments, we'll take brief time for questions just before we transition into our breakout rooms. Our structure will be the same as always. We'll do an initial presentation, and then we will take a quick question and answer, and then transition into breakout rooms and proceed from there. So this is the fourth session of the Nonprofit Navigation Series. The first were ably presented, as many of you know, by Dr. Scott Helm, the Associate Director of the Midwest Center. And today it's my privilege to pick up and talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, as many of you whom I know are familiar with. I do a lot of work with boards and governance, do a lot of study, and probably need to start off with all the usual cliches to talk about this. I have some observations and thoughts that I'd like to share with you, and then part of what's great about the structure is we'll get into discussion and hear what you're thinking about and what you're seeing as well as we get into this. I think there's some general insights and information that's beneficial to share, but I will have to say that, as some of you have heard me say before, when you've seen one board, you've seen one board, and they're different. Context makes a huge difference, but now we've found a time when it's even more of a dramatic difference, if you will, than it has been because of the context and variations that are there. By the way, thanks for taking that poll. I'll be curious to see what folks have to say, and we'll share in the middle of the session a little bit of what it is that you said were among the things that were particularly challenging. So again, thanks for being with us, and we'll get into talking about this. I do have PowerPoint set, as you know. Our materials are shared through Box, and Mark Culver has loaded that material, so we do have that ready to go now. What I want to do is get into this series. There we go. So obviously our topic is meaningful governance for a challenging time, and one of the things that concerned me, but we're talking about governance, so I felt it was essential to label it this way. But one of the things that people sometimes get confused about is whether boards are all we're talking about. And I shouldn't say all, because boards are critical, as you can well appreciate, but governance is actually a process. Boards do governance. They also do other things. It's not governance. Others participate in the process as well. Executives are part of the team. They're integral to governance as they go through this process as well, as the organization goes through the process. Both board and executive participate and contribute in different ways. At least ideally that's the case. Some of you have heard one of my colleagues laments about boards, an executive director who observed once that nonprofit boards are quite a lot like the human appendix, of no discernible value, but capable of serious pain and damage. And unfortunately, that does describe a few boards here and there. That's our worry, but the aspiration, of course, is that in fact, at its best, and we have the opportunity to see a lot of that in this region, we have boards that are exceptional in partnering with executive directors, and that's essential. Each part of the governance process is played differently, partly by boards, partly by executives. When I'm talking about governance, though, I'm talking about especially leadership and strategic direction. Candidly, when I'm thinking about what we're addressing right now, this is really a time for leadership, but it's leadership in ways that people sometimes haven't given as much thought to. So again, governance, leadership, strategic direction, resource development and allocating those resources, and then checking, following up, are we using those resources well, or are we achieving the results we need? And again, this is board work, but it's also executive work, and ideally they're doing it together. The whole notion of building bridges, strong relationships with the outside world is significant. And development, capacity building, growing the organization, and frankly, one of the things we'll talk about a little bit here is growing the capacity of the board as well. A lot of folks join boards not knowing quite what they were signed up for, but an awful lot of us signed up for boards not knowing what this season was going to be like and what the pandemic and the associated economic dislocations are going to be about. And of course, they shift radically from setting to setting. So meaningful governance, it's fundamentally leadership. So I've got a half dozen themes that is I've thought most about what is most critical at this time for the governance process, for boards and executives to be working together to address and frankly, to honor and take care of in the organization. So we'll get into these in some depth in each case, but first of all, and candidly, I find a lot of boards or a lot of people are kind of hunkering down, and so they're not thinking about this as much right now. But honoring and caring for your people is a critical element of meaningful governance. Affirming and sustaining that board staff partnership, and I will talk about that because I think that's one of those things that we need more than ever at this time. It's also one of those things that can fray, of course, at a tough time. Protecting the mission, the core of the organization and the work we're doing, knowing what it is, sustaining relationships, preserving cash and liquidity. A couple of these I won't get into as much depth on because Dr. Helm addressed them in a couple of the previous sessions, and they're posted so you can go back and take a look at those. Last but not least, we will be talking a bit about the imperative, even when it doesn't feel like maybe it's going to work that well. We need to strategize today for the future. How are we going to transition out of this crisis cycle that so many of us are caught in? How are we going to choose the next generation path? It's such a cliche right now to hear that we're going to have a new normal. Nobody's going back to the way things were. I believe that's valid, but I also believe that what we move to is a function of how we govern and what we do during this process. So just taking these things and highlighting them a little bit more, fundamentally, this whole notion of honoring and caring for your people is critical. Who are your people? Well, you know who they are. I mean, it's your staff, it's your clients, it's your board members, it's your funders, your partners, and more. But, there's a little bit of a personality dynamic to some of this too. When times get stressful, some of us hunker down, we kind of hide back and reassess and evaluate. Others immediately want to be out connecting with other folks. The reality is we need to be connecting, being present, showing that you care, and creating opportunities for others to do that with you is a really powerful force. And that sets the stage for what comes as you continue to work together. Empathizing, when Dr. Helm talks about design thinking and some of the principles he shared a little while ago, he loves to underscore this imperative of empathy, but it really is powerful. And if there's ever a time where people deserve empathy, sympathy in some cases, but empathy, this is really a critical part of it. Communication, of course, is always an issue, comes up in several of these, but it's always relevant to sustaining and connecting with people. Keep folks in the loop. Provide candid information. You don't need to scare the heck out of people, but the flip side is we need to be talking candidly with each other about what we do know. That also means, I think, not going beyond what we legitimately should say to actually, get into scenarios that are scary and scare the heck out of our staff or our board. But helping people track as we're learning things and process the information is so critical. And I understand why some folks will say, but I don't know anything. I don't have anything to say. Well, actually, you don't have anything to say perhaps about the content of the situation, or you don't have as much as you'd like. You do have things to say about some of the most important. we're still here. We're working together. We're here for the mission and our clients, for the community we serve, and talking about and building, sustaining that element. In fact, I'll say it again later, and I actually will mention it next week in a session on change. But one of the things that's critical at a time like this is that we draw on the resilience and energy of our community, whatever that is in your world, geographic, but also programmatic, political, others, to help sustain us. Dr. Helm talked about the 4 frames in a previous session. I'm not going to talk about them except to flag that different folks pay attention to different kinds of information. They're thinking about and framing our questions differently. Some folks look at it from a structural point of view. What are the laws, the rules? What are the things that are going on? Others are all back to the human resource domain. It's all about the people and the parts of that. Others are very political, and we've got to be political. There's a time when advocacy is significant, but we also have to be symbolic and address these things. All of those are elements that are important, but we do tend to, under stress, we revert back to our sort of earliest behaviors we learned and our natural inclinations, but that may not serve us as well. A critical part of this whole thing is affirming and sustaining that board, executive, and staff overall, but especially the board executive partnership. And we have, of course, this really strange environment. I mean, all of us are living with it all the time. Boards are part-time. They come and go in most cases more often than the executive leadership, and yet executives and the staff report to the board. So we have a unique, but it's just that, it's a unique but powerful connection when it works well. My colleagues Bob Herman and Dick Heimovitz, now retired both of them, but UMKC colleagues, did research and actually reported on this, shockingly, about 30 years ago, and labeled what they found among most effective executive work as board-centered executive leadership. What they said, what they found is they studied, and they were doing their work in Kansas City, but also somewhat beyond, highly effective CEOs are really good at enabling and supporting their boards to grow the capacity of the board to do what it is the board uniquely can do. And having dialogue, conversations, and supporting that is really critical. I've worked with executives who say, hey, I report to the board, it's their job to be in charge, to be leaders, whatever else. Frankly, that's a little naive and it doesn't work well. The executives who are most effective accept responsibility, not for replacing the board, but for supporting and facilitating the board's work. They're providing leadership, but as you see on my slide, I have to say, effective leadership is not dominance. It's collaborative partnership, it's shared leadership. And so these executives are especially attentive, and some of you know I've worked with many of you in workshops and other things. The truth is my role in many senses is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So depending on how you're feeling right now, we'll see how it goes. But these effective executives take responsibility for facilitating interaction, for making sure that bridging between the board and the staff, among the board and staff, are really energetic and meaningful. They exhibit and model consideration and respect. They're also working with the board to envision innovation and success, but using the board as the resource it is with its 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the domain of the organization to help them see things they might not otherwise see. These executives do initiate and create structures for the board to operate. That sounds fancy. What are we talking about? The most basic structure, an appropriate board agenda, agendas for meetings, but also plans and other things like that. So helping the board connect in that role. And frankly, I'm talking about executives, but what should happen is that the chair and the executive director are together. The CEO are helping this happen as an ongoing basis, especially when times are a little more challenging. I read one report recently that advocated, I think it was from McKinsey, they advocated the executive and board chairs should be in conversation every single day. The immediate comment from the executive who chose to comment overtly on that was, I don't think I can take talking to the board chair every day. I don't have enough time. I don't think it's going to work. I think this might hurt the relationship instead of help us. Find the balance, whatever it is. We're not all, we're not commodities. We have to figure out what works best. There are some folks who need more contact and some who need less. But of course, the critical element is providing timely and helpful information to the board, encouraging and promoting the board's capacity to succeed and do what it is. And that even means working with the board to think about, well, how do we continue to help the board learn, grow, and develop so it can continue to provide the kind of leadership that we need in our environment. So critical, taking care of our people, having that essential partnership. Thinking broader in the governance role, fundamental is protecting the mission and the core. Dr. Helm talked about this in several respects in the first session of our series here. But this is where the candid governance conversation between a board and executive, our executive leadership team, ideally, are so critical because we need to be taking stock. If you're not sure, but frankly, even if you think you are, facilitating this dialogue, what is core to our mission, and we must continue to do it? What is it that we must pause or put on hold because we can't do everything when resources are challenged? Are there some things that must be let go? Maybe this is actually the time when we just have to say, it was tough to do it before, but it's not central enough to the core. We've got to honor the core, the mission, the clients, and the needs that we're here to serve. Tougher to ask, perhaps, is the next question, which is what's not here that actually should be added because it's responsive to the environment we're in. One of the critical roles of governance is to keep the organization in sync with the external world, the outside environment. And both board and executive leaders have unique abilities to do that, but they're not the same. And so capitalizing on all of that. Fundamentally, we have to protect that core. We have to ensure that that is there because that's the foundation, the anchor for where we will go as we move beyond the crisis. And we need to remind ourselves of what that is. At the same time, not only do we need to honor our people, but we need to focus on sustaining relationships, all sorts of relationships. Again, I'm using that word empathy a lot, but it's so easy to get so swamped by the stresses and the urgencies of what's going on that we lose sight of the less immediate demanding in your face, but maybe longer term, more important elements to the relationships of governance. So making sure that we are engaged in our relationships, that we're empathetic as we interact with folks, being proactive, staying in touch. The communication is always important. By the way, one of the things, these relationships are inside, but they're also outside. And one of the things that I think organizations sometimes, because they're so stressed, don't take the time to think about is that this may be, in some ways, must be a time to sustain and enhance the relationships with your natural partners. Often nonprofits have partnerships or collaborations that are formally structured. You're often in alliances or networks that are linked to the field that, the mission category, the field that you're in. But of course, speaking of natural partnerships and relationships, your donors and your funders. Again, that communication issue I raised earlier is significant to the relationship part. We have to stay in touch. We have to be sharing what's going on. Now, you have to judge the nature of the relationship, but candidly, I've been so impressed by so many of the foundations, major donors, other philanthropists in the region, when they have reached out and said already, tell us how it's going, tell us what needs to happen. Many of them are removing or at least loosening restrictions and accountability structures on their grants. That, by the way, I forgot to put in the slides. Forget everything. How about saying thank you? We have to appreciate each other. And I will tell you candidly, many of you have written to me about one thing or another in the last couple of weeks and just said, thanks for what you're doing. We all need to hear that. And, I'd like to think you mean it. it's important to say that to our donors and those who are in our operating environment, our partners. You know, on the financial side, and again, you know, session 3 covered this in a couple of critical ways, so I'm just going to flag it, but it's central to governance at this tough time. Part of protecting the core is making sure we're preserving our cash and our liquidity. You know, that old cliche, cash is king. I don't particularly like the phrase, but unfortunately it seems to actually be very true. And in a time like this, to preserve our operating flexibility, we've got to have liquidity. Now, you know, you can't create liquidity overnight. Things are as they are, but going back and thinking about where and how do we address the most immediate obligations, and candidly protecting that cash, recognizing where you have it, or nearly cash, you know, it's equivalence, because you could turn something into cash fairly quickly. This is part of preserving your options so that as we're coming out of the crisis cycle, we actually have the potential to make choices that will be stronger and better for the organization and the clients we're here to serve. And last but not least is the thing that, you know, it's kind of tough in a way, but this is the leadership part as much or more than anything else here, which is helping people appreciate and envision the crisis is going to, we will transition out of this crisis. I don't think I can be so Pollyannish as to say lots of great things will come out of it, but some good things will. You know, Rahm Emanuel, the former chief of staff in the Obama administration and former mayor of Chicago, has observed that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Well, you know, the truth is, if we can back up and get it in perspective, there are some opportunities and leverage points in a crisis that help us, or at least allow us, to go back and reassess the core, reassess the fundamentals, and then think about what does that mean for the era that we're moving toward. One of the things, you know, again, we're talking about governance, we're talking about the board and executive relationship. So let me just flag that one of the most useful things to do from a strategizing and governing perspective, when you're not clear where exactly and how and what's the timing that this will all play out, develops in a few scenarios. Think in terms of scenarios. Don't immediately try to figure out what's the future condition, what should I predict, or what could we predict, and then go there. Cover your bases a bit. I mean, there are definitely more and less likely futures for your organization, for your clients, for the relationships in the community that you're here to serve. Take some time, you know, that old cliche, we use it a lot in our leadership classes, the notion of going to the balcony. You know, it's a metaphor. You know, if you think about you're at the Sprint Center watching basketball games, or you're watching a concert or whatever, when you're on the floor, you see things going on, you're in the middle of it all, but you only see what's happening right around you. If you go back and go up to the balcony, you then have the opportunity to see a different perspective. It's still the same place, but you're understanding it differently. Particularly, you're seeing patterns and dynamics and trends as you look over time that can inform, should inform, how you make sense of what's happening and where things are going. This crisis stage is going to end, and you know, it's great, it's essential that we focus on making it through this time. I'm sorry that some places are in a tough enough situation that they're going to be really challenged to survive. Although, you know, the Nonprofit Quarterly, ironically, a half a year ago said, we must, this is a magazine, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a quarterly magazine. Their editors said a half a year ago, you know, we don't know what's going to cause it, but there must be a recession coming, because we've just had too long a period of growth and development. Something's going to happen. And so ironically, they're putting together this issue on how to govern and manage in a time of a recession and understanding recessions And it's published like literally right now. It's coming out just as we're hitting this difficult pandemic recession cycle. But one of the things that their research found, particularly a colleague and friend of ours from Minnesota, heads their nonprofit association, a guy named John Pratt, for all of the trauma that we went through in the Great Recession, we as a sector, the nonprofit sector, the fact of the matter is, nonprofits actually grew, hired more people, and continued to grow and develop through the recession. You know, giving and certain revenue models were more stressed, some more than others. When you're taking stock, by the way, figure out which of those revenue models that are a part of your business approach, your enterprise design, which of them are more and less stressed, which of them are going to experience more significant challenges, and which of them maybe are going to help you be more resilient. Because one of the questions is, how do we preserve our resilience and look to the future and frankly, help our colleagues envision what is out there? That is a fundamental part of leadership. It's the, leadership as governance part of this as well. Our clients and our community need us to be ready as we're coming out of this. And, when the building's on fire, I am in favor of putting the fire out before you start planning on other things. But it doesn't stop there. It won't stop there. Our clients' needs, some of them will be more severe as we transition along this path. Some of them will just be different, but we have to be thinking about that. And so, as I've written in the slide, to me, this is the epitome of effective governance, to discern the future. And by the way, I use the word discern very intentionally. It takes judgment. It takes multiple perspectives in dialogue with each other to sort out what are the more versus less likely scenarios. But by the way, contingency planning suggests that the couple of scenarios that are most likely are worth working and getting into in dialogue with the rest of your executive and board colleagues in governance, so that how do we leverage the forces that are in play today to position us to serve in this new environment. The seeds of the future are being planted right now. So, here's that, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable thing. The seeds of the future are being planted. So what are you planting? I mean, are we so captured by the angst of these moments that in fact we're captive by that, we don't even see the possibilities? And candidly, when it comes to leadership and motivation, helping people appreciate that there is hope, there is a future, is an essential part of honoring and supporting people as they go through this. Again, let's not lie to people, but let's be candid about we have possibilities, and frankly, invite others to be a part of it. Make inventing the future more of a team process. By the way, I've got one line in here that actually is I should have posted an article, I suppose, about it. I can still do that in Box. Mark Culver will do that. Governance is not only risk management. Risk management is controlling for the downside. But I put together an article. I firmly believe that we don't serve our clients or our organization well, excuse me, if we only focus on managing and controlling and mitigating risks. There are times when, in fact, we should be taking risks, and one of the conversations at this time, critical governance conversation, is what risks should we be taking, because they're the right risks, they're worth the risk. By the way, the point of risk is you can have some degree of calculation as to the potential likelihood and consequence of its loss. That's part of what makes it risk. But if you take the safe path, you may stay safe right out of existence. And one of the reasons you will potentially go out of existence is if we play it too safe and we're no longer meaningful in the lives and work of our community and the clients we serve, it's kind of like, who cares if we're here? That's a big risk too. But let's face it, this is a phenomenal time to help people appreciate how is it that you and your organization uniquely add value to the future of the community and the clients that we're here to serve. Clients who, in way too many cases, are so much in survival mode, they don't have a way to look a little bit further. But if we can create a platform and a stage for some of this to happen, we will be honoring the mission and the core while we do what we're doing. Now, are we taking the right risks for the right reasons? That's a fundamental and powerful governance conversation. So we're going to prepare for our breakout sessions. If you've been with us before, you know that the Zoom system, helpfully and sometimes strangely, does break out groups. You can assign people to groups, but sometimes it ends up being a bit uneven. So Monica Rizak and Cindy Laufer are monitoring who's where and doing this shuffling. In box, you have a worksheet that I would ask you to discuss with your colleagues when you break into your small groups. Your small groups will be about 6 people. Let's just share some of how boards and executives are really usefully helping each other. What are you seeing that's really worked, that's been successful? So how has your board been of greatest help and support to your agency's executive team at this tough time? You know what? And by the way, have you told them where they are being really helpful? And by the way, I'm not just saying this to executives. If you're a board chair, you need to encourage your board too, saying thanks. Hey, cool. This is, you know, appreciating what it is folks do and acknowledging it, catching them doing great stuff is a really valuable part of governance and leadership. So the first question, how has your board been of great help? The second is the flip side. How has your agency's executive team been of greatest help and support to the board? Now, by the way, you know, the frame of reference here is about governance, but governance in the leadership big picture sense. The third is, I'd love it if you would each identify and share with each other, and then hopefully we'll hear a little bit about it when we come back to full group too. You know, what are some of the strategies that you've seen in your agency or maybe in your colleague agencies that have seemed especially helpful for enabling boards and staffs to stay connected and work well together as they grow this next generation of the future of the organization? So I'm going to stop the sharing with the slide presentation, and let's take a few comments and questions. We'll take about 5 minutes for this as we transition, and then we'll move into the breakout groups and have more specific discussion in those topics. But what do you think? What do you have to say?
Dave, there was a question earlier from Lauren with Innovate Her, KC. What are some actionable strategies that we can integrate into our daily routines to encourage our boards? What are some specific best practices you've seen successfully implemented?
Well, thanks for highlighting that, Scott. One of the things that I've alluded to, but let me come back to it fairly specifically. I'm not sure that we should be on a long phone call with our board chair and executive director every day. That may or may not align with the flow of what needs to happen in the work of the agency. But having a regular opportunity for check-in and structure these things. You know, if you wait for them to happen sort of because it's logical or it'll be, you know, I'll touch base with when there's something important. You lose track or you don't see some of those critical issues, and the motivation and leadership side of this demands that we reach out and take care of the relationships even while we are working on the content. One of the things we know about team performance and effective teams is that it's essential to be very strong on the task side, but we've also got to deal with the social side, or it ends up disrupting our performance on the task side. So the metaphor I've sometimes used is like the gasoline engine in a car. You've got to have gas in the tank, and the engine's got to perform well. You step on the gas and the car can go. But the social side is like the oil, the lubricant. If you don't have oil in the engine, you'll step on the gas and you'll go for about a quarter of a mile, and it'll freeze up, and then you won't get anything done either, and even though you've got a full tank of gas. We have to strike that balance, and candidly, some of us are more attuned to the social, some are more attuned to the task side. What I suggest with this sort of team orientation is find a couple of partners that you're regularly thinking about. Are we keeping the board in the loop? The board is actively thinking about, are we connecting with the staff on the things that we can uniquely have benefit and add unique value? One of the things I mentioned earlier in terms of taking care of relationships is, in terms of those relationships in the community, one of the conversations to think about is, well, which of those ought really occur from executive or supervisory managerial staff? Which of those conversations might usefully be done by board members, or maybe even necessarily by board members? Now, again, take a few minutes to plan it out so that everybody knows who's taking care of what. But I will say, I've been concerned that I've seen boards, several organizations, not have board meetings because there's so much stuff to take care of. I worry about that. Maybe it's warranted, but it almost never is. And so you're leaving out a crucial resource team and, frankly, a critical group of people who are in a position to help and are legally accountable for helping. I haven't hit the legal stuff, but the reality is, ethically, you're obligated to keep the board in the loop and engage. But let's also, let's not just honor the legal side. Let's actually make it work by being intentional. So having some structure for checking in. And, candidly, as an executive director, maybe you have somebody else on your staff who's assigned to just on a day-to-day or every other day basis, identify, not a lot, but one or two key things that are unfolding for us that would be beneficial to share with the staff, and create check-in ways. One of the things that's been highlighted by a number of folks is that this is a very alienating and isolating time in some strange ways, which is part of why we just have to create these check-in opportunities, virtual office hours or things like that. Sometimes the structure is to simply create the place and say, we're going to take a half hour and any board member can call in and touch base with us. Ideally, the executive director and or the chair are hosting that kind of a thing, but create that space for everybody to be involved. One of the other worries I have, frankly, is that in some boards, particularly boards that have a fairly strong or very strong executive committee, strong in the sense of they exercise the authority of the board very often, is that you actually end up with an insider-outsider dynamic on the board, and at the least, you're losing some of the connections that could be beneficial there among your team, your board team. At worst, what's happening is you're actually creating conflicts that, as things calm down the road, these things will come back to haunt you later on. Building on that earlier observation about what seeds are you planting now, how you engage with people and in what ways is going to be part of what people will remember 2, 3, 5 months later, maybe a year and 2 years later as well. So let's go to the breakout rooms. I would appreciate it if you'd just take a few minutes to share with your colleagues that you're going to be, what is it you've seen that's worked in terms of board supporting executive staff, staff supporting executive or the board leadership. To answer the question that I just took a shot at, what are some of the other strategies that you've seen work? Let's share them.